This is a reading from Evidence of Satan in the Modern World by Leon Christiani. Ministerial Intervention. If, as many of the more enlightened maintained, these wholesale imitations, which distorted the impression created by the appearance to Bernadette, were inspired by the devil, it must be admitted that they were, at least, adroitly inspired. The facts we have related were, at any rate, in part, known to the civil authorities. This was not astonishing, since it was the duty of the authorities to maintain public order, an order frequently and transparently endangered by the disturbances at the grotto and in neighboring villages. On the 30th of July, 1858, Ministre des Cultes, Monsieur Rouland, wrote a very necessary letter to the Bishop of Tarbes, Monsignor Lawrence. This letter is so revealing that it is worth quoting in full. Monseigneur, recent reports on the Lourdes affairs seem to me liable to cause profound distress amongst sincerely religious people. The blessing of rosaries by children, the manifestations so frequently associated with women of loose character, the crowning of visionaries, the grotesque ceremonies which are nothing but parodies of religious rites, all this would have stimulated a flood of attacks from Protestants and other papers if the central authority had not intervened to restrain their ardor. But these scandalous scenes are nonetheless calculated to discredit religion in the eyes of the people, and I conceive it to be my duty, Monseigneur, once more to invite your most serious attention to these facts. Your Grace will understand that the government had no objection in principle to the setting up of a new center of pilgrimage. If I insisted firmly that there should be no sequel to the first manifestations at the Grotto of Lourdes, it was because detailed reports from various sources had convinced me that there was nothing serious or reputable either in the origin, the development, or in the fruits of this popular movement. Events have confirmed my conviction. The multiplication of visionaries and ecstatics, which recall the unfortunate scenes of the 18th century, and the wild demonstrations which are now taking place on the banks of the Gave, would alone be sufficient to justify the measures taken by authority. These regrettable manifestations seem to me to warrant the clergy departing from the strict reserve they have hitherto maintained. For the rest, I can only make an urgent appeal to your Grace's prudence and strength of mind by inquiring whether you would not see fit to utter a public condemnation of such profanations. This letter is clearly a courteous but categorical demand for action. What the minister wished, expected, and requested, as made clear by his allusions to the historic disorders in the cemetery of Saint Médard in the 18th century, was no less than episcopal intervention, which should take the form of a general reproof and condemnation of all stories of visions, including Bernadette's, which had certainly stimulated all the others. If the bishop had yielded to this request and intervened without regard to the Pauline precept, hold fast to that which is good, it would have indeed been a victory for the powers of evil. Village jealousies. This danger was in fact by no means illusory, since in the month of July 1858, the bishop had just been informed by one of his curés of a new epidemic of collective exaltation in the vicinity of Lourdes. There was a new wave of competition in supernatural visions occurring in neighboring villages, and not only in Lourdes, where so many of the inhabitants had already felt able to improve on the record of poor little Bernadette, so unqualified they felt to be chosen by the Blessed Virgin in preference to others. On July 9th, the Abbé Pierre Junca, curé of Austin, had written to Monsignor Lawrence to inform him of what was taking place in his parish. A young boy, Laurent Lacaze, aged 10, had asked to be allowed to go to the grotto one morning after school. It was the 2nd of July. He was so insistent that his parents gave way. At about noon, Laurent, with his brother aged 8, was in front of the grotto. He was reciting a rosary when he raised his eyes and saw a woman dressed in white, carrying a very small child on her left arm. This child had a bouquet of 3 red roses in his right hand. On his head was a red cap, decorated with 3 white roses, held in place by a red ribbon. The woman had 3 red roses in her right hand. From her right arm was hanging a broad, red, scalloped ribbon. Hanging from the same arm was a beautiful rosary. On her head was a white bonnet, with a white ribbon round it. Two men were standing one on each side of the woman, both clad in black and wearing blue berets. The man on the right had a long white beard. Both the woman and the men were wearing black shoes. Such is the description in the curé's letter of 9th of July, so the young Lacaze had had plenty of time in which to elaborate his miraculous vision. The woman had told him to come again that afternoon, so he obeyed, and he had again seen the same personages as in the morning. They had all set off together, leading the boy and his mother, who had accompanied him, along the path which led to their own village of Austin. On the way, the woman shared in Laurent's childish jokes. On the days which followed, Laurent returned to the grotto and had more visions. But he was now accompanied. Processions formed up behind him. The curé, having been informed, felt it advisable to sprinkle the child with holy water, and also the place where he said he had seen the woman, without, it appears, any perceptible result. The stories themselves are banal enough, but the inhabitants of Austin were in a turmoil. They reproached their curé for betraying signs of doubt. As for him, he consulted his bishop as to his line of action. Meanwhile, other visionaries had appeared. Jean-Marie Pommier, 13, and Jean-Marie Sartre, 10. The latter was from Ségus, another village in the vicinity, but his visions did not last long. The curé and others ordered him to stop at home. He did so, and there were no more visions. The two children from Austin, however, continued their activities, which have been described as follows. For some considerable time they were, so to say, pursued and obsessed by the vision. They ran after her in the streets and into houses as if they were on a hunt. Their cries were often more like howls, and their movements awkward and ungainly. More often than not, people were shocked by their disorderly and unseemly conduct. The parents, taking an innocent pride in the belief that their sons were seeing the Blessed Virgin, were partly responsible for failing to terminate these regrettable scenes. We are quoting from the report sent in by the curé of Ségus. The mayor of Austin, Jean Vergès, was also taking note of what was happening. Father Cross quotes extensively from his report, which follows the same lines. It seems clear that young Lacaze really saw visions. Those who were present could not fail to believe that they were visions of the Blessed Virgin, and this was not astonishing. Why should Bernadette have a monopoly? Laurent Lacaze's parents certainly did not see why. The mayor, who questioned them, reported the Lacazes did not go to work. Both parents, and particularly the father, rejoiced at what was happening to their son. One evening I met the father, who was going haymaking. I said, "You have lost a day's work." He replied, "Yes, but at least we have been in good company, the company of the Blessed Virgin." But this was not all. According to the mayor's deposition, astonishing things were happening to the children of the village. For instance, Laurence Lacaze, who previously only knew the patois, now began to speak in French. There was more to come, according to the mayor's report. One day, Jean-Pierre Pommier, a boy of 13, was in the Lacaze house, standing about 6 feet from an attic window, overlooking the courtyard. This window was 2 feet high by 18 inches broad, and more than 3 feet from the floor. Suddenly the boy looked into the courtyard, saw a vision there, and disappeared like a flash of lightning through the window, without touching the sides, landed on his feet in the yard, and ran after the vision. This so upset me that I immediately withdrew, and when I got home I said to my wife, "There's something queer about this business. I can't get over it." Father Cross quotes other witnesses to the event. He states that he has himself examined the place where it happened and finds it humanly inexplicable. He adds that the young visionaries displayed another anomaly, which was common to all of them. They had a horror of rosaries which had been blessed, and wanted only new and unblessed rosaries. No object that had been blessed was returned by them if put into their hands. Monsignor Laurence had received accurate and detailed reports of all these events. On the 12th of July, 1858, he replied to the curé of Austin, "I consider the boys Lacaze and Pommier, the visionaries, to be suffering from an affliction of the nerves. They must be treated as such. As far as I can judge, there is nothing supernatural in their experiences. Celestial beings do not make futile remarks. They are not frivolous or familiar. If these children say or do unseemly things, they must be scolded and treated with severity. But the bishop had to repeat his recommendations before they were accepted and respected by ordinary people. So the Austin Visionaries were to continue their bizarre activities for some time longer. There is abundant evidence as to how these young prophets were followed, admired, and obeyed. When passing the Lacaze house, people would kneel in the street and utter a prayer to the Blessed Virgin. Some spent the night in the room where the visionary slept. The curé from his pulpit spoke of the bishop's letter, forbidding children under 15 to go to the grotto and prohibiting the others from communicating with the visionaries. His parishioners refused to believe him until he showed them the actual letter. The curé's sister, Françoise Junca, adds, "The neighboring villages were jealous of Austin. For us, it was a heavy responsibility. My brother spent many a sleepless night over it." We have already drawn attention to this jealousy of Austin in the neighboring villages. There was a similar outburst against Lourdes. One day, relates an inhabitant of Omex, another nearby village, "I was at the grotto, and the young visionaries from Austin, with many others from Lourdes, were in the hollow of the rock, when the devil appeared to them. Suddenly a voice could be heard coming from the cleft in the rock, a very light voice, like that of a rather spoilt and affected child. The voice was saying, 'In the valley of Bat-sur-Guerre, and especially at Austin, there are a lot of good people. At Lourdes, they are only riffraff.' So I stood up in front of everybody and said, 'Whoever it is, he's more devilish than the devil himself. The Blessed Virgin doesn't despise anyone, and still less those who are badly in need of conversion.' But those who were present were nonetheless disturbed and agitated. One woman from Austin was so flattered by what she had heard that she would have built a chapel to the Virgin in her room if her husband had not stopped her. This unfortunate woman, incidentally, went mad and died within a year. But we have said enough to show the extent of the disturbances provoked by these devilments at Lourdes and in the immediate neighborhood, and to make it abundantly clear that the bishop had need of all his prudence to steer a path through all these more or less fantastic manifestations. If the devil had wished to discredit the appearances of the Blessed Virgin to Bernadette by confusing them in a medley of grotesque imitations and exaggerations, he was, one must admit, not far from achieving his aim. Fortunately, Monsignor Laurence did not allow himself to be imposed on. On the 28th of July, 1858, he signed the order convoking a commission of inquiry into the Lord's visions. What was remarkable, however, was that from the beginning, the only name specifically mentioned as the object of the inquiry was that of Bernadette Soubirous. There was no mention, for instance, of all the numerous other manifestations we have described. In the eyes of sensible persons, they were nothing but imagination, exaggeration, oddities, perhaps even the work of the devil. The reader who has had the opportunity of studying this collection of phenomena may well be astonished at their number, intensity, and peculiarity, and may even have formed a rather unfortunate impression, in retrospect, of the appearances to Bernadette. Yet, if he reflects a moment, he will note that still more astonishing is the way all the heavy clouds of doubt and suspicion disappeared quite naturally and simply in the light of truth. The bishop's commission set to work without delay. The simplicity, uprightness, perseverance, and evident sincerity of Bernadette on the one hand, and on the other the miracles, the authentic miracles which had meanwhile occurred at the grotto, were sufficient to convince the commission, and when, at the end of 3 years' work, it completed its task, Monsignor Laurence was able to set the seal of his solemn approval on the events at Lourdes, such as we know them from the life of Bernadette. But it is natural to wonder what happened to the host of impromptu visionaries whose exploit had been a household word in the district of Lourdes for so many months. The Austin Visionaries. When, in 1878, Father Cross made his historic investigation with such scrupulous exactitude, he came to know the Austin Visionaries. Naturally, by 1878, they had grown up. How much of their earlier experiences remained in their minds? Nothing, or almost nothing. They had both become excellent Christians. Both Laurent Lacaze and Jean-Pierre Pommy were amongst those serving as chief acolytes in the parochial procession of the Holy Sacrament. Father Cross questioned them. Laurent Lacaze, the first, said that he had hardly any recollection of what he had seen and done in 1858. I remember, he said, that I used to go to the grotto with other children, that I saw a kind of shadow, but I have no idea whether it had any outline or whether it was a man or a woman. I don't remember what I was doing on the road from Lourdes to Austin. To the majority of those who remembered a little better, this kind of shadow that Laurent had seen could only have been the devil. Jean-Pierre Pommy, when questioned by Father Cross, declared, I used to go often to the grotto, attracted by all the stories of what was going on there. During these visits, I twice had a vision. The first time I saw a dazzling light in the hollow of the rock, and in the middle of it a rather thick shadow. The light was neither red nor white, and stood about 3 feet high. I could not distinguish any face. This lasted about a quarter of an hour. The second time I saw the same thing, but I was very surprised at what happened to a little girl who also had visions. I was kneeling between her and a boy. We all three saw the same light. Then the little girl stretched out her hand towards the place where we saw the light, and the candle she was holding in her hand suddenly disappeared, and we could not make out where it had gone to. We were all very surprised. Thus Jean-Pierre Pommy, too, had only seen a rather thick shadow, with a light which was neither red nor white, but very bright. This was the same boy who, in the presence of witnesses, had so light-heartedly and with such preternatural dexterity, jumped through a very narrow window. Yet, in 1878, it could be said of him, together with his fellow visionary Laurent Lacaze, they are living as honest and Christian men. The spirit of evil took advantage of their innocence, but neither of them was the deliberate accomplice of Satan. Such is the tribute paid by Father Cross, after having seen and spoken to them. The Visionaries of Lourdes. The same faculty of oblivion was to be found amongst the numerous visionaries of Lourdes. Father Cross naturally questioned them as well, and observed that the majority only retained the vaguest recollections of their so-called visions in 1858 to 1859. Indeed, shortly after the epidemic of apparitions, the Abbé Serre, priest at Lourdes and in constant touch with the catechism class, had already noted that the greater number, on reaching the age of their first communion, assuming that this occurred at Lourdes, as in many other French dioceses, between 12 and 14, had only a confused memory of the sights which had appeared to them at the grotto or elsewhere. But Father Cross questioned some of them 20 years later. Here's the reply made by one, Alexandre François L. I didn't like wandering about, and my parents kept me close to their side, so I should not have gone to the grotto unless some of my school friends had persuaded me. So I climbed with them into the upper cavity and knelt down to pray. Then I saw a vision, white as a sheet of paper, emerging from the back of the cave. It did seem to have human shape, but I could not make out either face or hands or feet. As soon as the other children began to speak, I could not see it. I told them to be quiet, and the vision reappeared. I saw it come back like this at least 5 times. Believe it or not, I did see it, and it was beautiful. Another, whom Father Cross calls the most famous of the former visionaries, who had now become the father of 4 children, replied, I was present once or twice when the visions appeared to Bernadette, and at the time I was impressed, like the others, but I didn't think much about it afterwards, until one day, coming back with a boy of my own age from a walk in the forest, we went to the grotto together. As I was there praying, something passed in front of my eyes, something which had the face of a man. I began to laugh and then to cry, and everyone said I'd had a vision. I told my friend what I had seen. Some women came to my house and took me to La Ribera. Sometimes I saw nothing at all. At other times I saw the same thing, and I would cry, to your knees, kiss the ground, because I was frightened. Sometimes I also saw this apparition moving from one tree to another in the field. I used to ask people for their rosaries and bathe them in the Gave because I felt like it. One day when I was alone in the grotto, seeing the vision, the priest who had the cross put up on top of the ger came to the grotto and seeing me said, Get out of there. "What you see is the enemy of the true vision," and I went away. The other children would make faces, just as I did, and they would shout, but I don't know what they were shouting. I was afraid. I never went to the grotto alone except by day. I would not have dared to go there at night if the women hadn't come and fetched me. They believed I used to see the Blessed Virgin. Sometimes it was 10 or 10:30 when we got back. The women used to ask me, "What did you see?" I used to answer, "The Blessed Virgin," but it was really a man that I saw. The face wasn't always the same. There was sometimes a beard. Once I saw this being dressed in white, but I don't remember noticing any hands or feet. It's all very mixed up now. I couldn't say exactly what it was. This was the closest Father Cross could get to any precise recollection of all these visions 20 years later. However, the former visionaries were all positive on 2 points. Firstly, that no one had ever introduced them to simulate visions, but that they came from within, or from the devil, shall we say, as many others have done. And secondly, that their activities were always frowned on by the police and other persons in authority. Conclusion. Our conclusion could hardly be very different from that reached by Father Cross, who studied the phenomena very closely, and to whom we are indebted for many facts. He was convinced that Satan was truly the mainspring of all these manifestations, because there was a similarity, a sequence, and one might even say a strategy behind them all, which could hardly have been the work of any of the protagonists. They resembled the chorus of a Greek tragedy, whose voices we hear, but whose leader could only have been the devil. If we see Satan as the orchestrator of the phenomena, it would explain much of the bizarre character of these events, for Satan cannot fail to sign his own handiwork. By God's grace, there was such a difference between the visionaries, whether women, young girls or boys, and little girls, and the composed and tranquil Bernadette, that no one could be mistaken, and the distinction between good and evil, the true and the false, became self-evident. We should mention Father Cross's final appreciation of the situation, in which we concur, see volume 3, page 272. We have shown elsewhere how the proof of what is divine arises from the impotence of the most powerful contradictions. Whether the opponents be official or self-appointed, neither the one nor the other can stop what is happening or slow it down. What was happening in their eyes was nothing but Bernadette, and Bernadette herself was nothing. The cloud of visionaries was dissipated, and soon they were no more spoken of. The light of the true visionary pierced the clouds, and the cloud itself served only as a foil to the purity of her light. Thus the opposition of the devil was overcome, like the opposition of men. For a time, Satan could count on the support of religious people led astray by his devices, and this was the greatest danger of all. Yet, even this dark shadow was illuminated by the divine work. The most powerful patronage was of no avail to the visionaries, who disappeared with their grimaces, leaving only the luminous figure of Bernadette, bathed in sincerity and peace. The success of the centenary celebration, which ended at Lourdes at the beginning of 1959, is a proof of the radiance which now encircles the name of the humble Bernadette Soubirous, who saw the Blessed Virgin in 1858. We should not forget, however, that Bernadette, of simple peasant stock, like the Curé d'Ars, ended her days in the convent of Nevers, and that in her last hours she had to struggle against the devil, as the Curé d'Ars had to do throughout his life. As she lay dying, in fact, she displayed for a moment a great fear, and one of the nuns who was tending her heard her say very clearly, "Leave me, Satan," but soon afterwards the little saint recovered her tranquility and died in an atmosphere of victorious peace. I'll pick that up next time.